defend the said prince.
Four of the troopers had escaped with their lives. Each in turn was now called as a witness.
Gentlemen, I shall now call another of the survivors of the escape. Sergeant Robert Willis, Captain Bettington's Natal horse. Sergeant Willis, did you see the prince on foot after the attack began?
No, sir.
Did you get any orders as to rallying or firing on the enemy?
No, sir.
Was any attempt made to help the prince by anyone?
None.
Were you surprised that no attempt was made to rescue the prince?
No, sir. I do not think any rescue could have been made.
Do you think it would have been possible for mounted men to have rallied on the far side of the Donga and made good their escape?
Yes, in about 200 yards, sir.
You saw two men fall. Was it from off their horses?
Yes, sir, I saw them fall off their horses. Though whether they were firmly in the saddle, I can't say.
Who do you now think were the two men that fell from their horses?
When I got over the Donga, I knew that they were the Prince and Trooper Abel.
Did you consider that either of these men that fell had any chance of getting away?
None whatsoever.
Could anything have been done to save them?
No, nothing, sir.
Why?
The number of the Zulus was too great, and they were too close behind us. When they fired, I think they were only 3 yards off. The man that lost his balance was done.
How many Zulus, judging by the fire, were at the attack?
From the numbers of shots fired, I should put them at 40 or 50, sir.
How many do you think had firearms?
I should think about that number. The firing was very rapid, sir.
Could the escort, by being rallied, have defended the prince?
In my opinion, it could not.
After the detailed evidence of each of the witnesses had been fully examined and scrutinized by the court, and after 6 days of continuous hearings, Carey came to his final statement.
Gentlemen, I have now to address you in my defense against a charge as serious as it is possible to bring against any officer. First, no matter how deplorable is the death of the prince, I shall venture to assume that if I am guilty, I should have been equally guilty if my conduct had led to the death of the humblest soldier of this force. Secondly, whether senior or junior to the prince, it was unquestionably my duty to do all in my power to rescue him from the perilous position in which he was placed.
Gentlemen, I fail to see that anything was done. No word of any witness goes to show that the slightest attempt was made either to rally or defend the prince, whereas all are agreed that they galloped away. Now, gentlemen, imagine yourselves in the terrible position of the late prince, and I ask if you do not feel surprised that nothing was done to save him. Think of the distance he was able to run after the vanishing horseman. About 225 yards by the map in a direct line. He is simply left to his death by a party of mounted men, armed with rifles, who had gained the comparative safety of the far side of the Donga, in full view of which this brave young man was simply hunted down without a hand being raised in his defense.
I ask the court to consider the position. A man reports to me that the prince is killed. I see no signs of him near the Donga and see no reason to doubt that he was shot from off his horse. On my honor as an officer and a gentleman, I then believe the prince was either dead or escaping in another direction. Now I ask what good could have been done by rallying the escort without any pronounced object, an action which might, by the loss of our horses, have imperiled our retreat. I deeply regretted the loss of the young prince and would willingly have changed places with him. But I did not believe, and I do not now believe, that any effort of mine could have saved him. Gentlemen, I now leave the matter in your hands. I have endeavored in my defense to lay before the court a plain, unvarnished tale of the affray and its surrounding circumstances. And I trust my defense entirely to that statement, feeling sure that my conduct will be judged by those who will place themselves in their imagination in the position that fell to my lot, and who will honestly ask themselves whether my conduct was such as to leave me not only a future of bitterness, but also of unavailing regret.
Gentlemen, I must now remind the court that all the witnesses you have heard are to some extent defending their own characters, and are therefore more likely to exaggerate their own difficulties and the number of their enemy. Excepting perhaps Trooper Latalk, who, together with Rogers, who was killed, comes well out of the whole affair. This witness, having immediately after the volley deliberately dismounted, recovered his rifle, got up, lying with his stomach on the saddle, and in this position was carried away, racing after the other horses which were galloping in front. I leave all the evidence to speak for itself, and I draw my most painful observations to a close, leaving it to you, gentlemen, to decide whether or no the foregoing evidence establishes the words misbehaved before the enemy.
The verdict was guilty. Lieutenant Jalil Brenton Carey was sentenced to be cashiered. But as the findings were subject to confirmation in London, he wasn't told of them at once. He was simply sent off to England on the next available troopship, still technically under close arrest and in total ignorance of his fate. By this time, another troopship was making full speed for England with the Prince's body. It reached Spithead, whence it was taken on the Admiralty yacht Enchantress up the river to Woolwich. The press coverage was now building up to its maximum. Every moment of the unfolding tragedy was minutely and often quite marvellously represented. A military gun carriage bore the body to Chislehurst. It had taken 3 weeks for the news of her son's death to reach the Empress Eugénie. She was totally prostrated. She had retired to her darkened room, eating nothing, seeing no one. Hurrying down from Balmoral, Queen Victoria came directly to Camden House. She was in a torment of self-reproach for having allowed Louis to go to Africa and of shame for the manner of his death. Perhaps to make amends, the Queen insisted that his burial service at Chislehurst should become practically a state funeral. The Illustrated London News reporter wrote,
"The 200 cadets of the Royal Military Academy were stationed nearest Camden House. The gun carriage was drawn by 6 dark brown horses, the coffin itself being draped with the Union Jack and the French tricolour. There was no sun to flash back from the helmets of the Lancers. At the church, the bishop sprinkled the coffin with holy water and recited the De Profundis. To those who thought of the childless Empress in her lonely house, the sight was much more than impressive.
That day, the country was united in its grief, but voices of protest were already beginning to be heard. Had Carey really behaved like a coward? Were there not other senior officers every bit as much to blame? Lord Chelmsford himself, for example, who had specific orders to keep the Prince out of danger. Or Colonel Harrison, for having completely failed to set up any pattern of command. Or indeed, as Carey himself said, was anybody really to blame at all? If the victim had been just an ordinary serving soldier, would the whole incident not simply have been written off as part of the fortunes of war? Soon, a protest was actually made in the church at Woolwich, where the prince had worshipped.
To the Empress, her son's life, which was as precious and necessary as her own, has been utterly thrown away. Productive of no good, promotive of no end, except that of killing a few uncivilized savages, fighting for their homes as we in former times often fought for ours. It was a sacrifice he, as a Frenchman, was not called on to make. It was the duty of those who had the direction of the amiable prince to have put this before him. It would have saved him an untimely end, and his desolate mother a world of grief.
In early July, the war ended with the total defeat of the Zulus. But the Carey affair was only just beginning. Now, everywhere, in regimental messes, in society drawing rooms, in East End pubs and West End clubs, men were practically coming to blows.
The fact is that the whole party was startled by the sudden volley and lost their presence of mind. The prince's fate had been sealed.
See why he should be held entirely responsible for an occurrence which, after all, is bound to happen in every campaign for the simple reason that the victim was, in this case...
Excuse the eagerness to escape which led Lieutenant Carey to gallop 500 yards before he turned his head.
He ought to have thought of nothing but the safety of the prince, and every man should have perished, rather than that harm should have come.
The more the circumstances of Carey's case are looked into, the more reason is there to believe that the court-martial was got up to find a convenient scapegoat.
The Empress Eugénie's own feelings were to have a crucial effect on the outcome. She had said to the Queen,
"Tell me, they won't do anything to that poor man?"
Later, she issued a formal statement.
"The one earthly consolation I have is the knowledge that my beloved child fell as a soldier, obeying orders, and that those who gave them did so because they thought him competent and useful. Enough of recriminations. Let the memory of his death unite in a common sorrow all those who loved him, and let no one suffer, either in his reputation or in his interests. I, who can desire nothing more on earth, ask it as a last prayer."
Those words of the Empress were decisive. Within 2 months of the trial, the combined influence of the press and the prevailing feelings of the British public reached their fullest intensity. It was necessary for all major court-martial findings to be submitted to the sovereign. Expectations were at fever pitch when an announcement came from Whitehall.
The War Office, August the 16th, 1879. The proceedings of the General Court-Martial on a charge of misbehavior before the enemy having been submitted to the Queen, Her Majesty has been advised that the charge is not sustained by the evidence, and has accordingly been graciously pleased not to confirm the proceedings. Captain Carey is released from arrest and will rejoin his regiment for duty.
This was a total reversal of the court-martial verdict, achieved after the fullest national debate and expressing the widest national feeling. A year later, in 1880, the Empress Eugénie set out for South Africa on a strange emotional pilgrimage. She departed from Southampton as her son had done. The press saw her leave for the 6-week voyage to the Cape of Good Hope aboard the SS Germania. Once in Africa, the party set out for Zululand. On May the 25th, they arrived at the Little Kraal. There, the Empress planted shoots of willow and ivy from the churchyard at Chislehurst. They now rise from the open plain to a height of 40 feet. On the first anniversary of Louis's death, his mother kept a night-long vigil where he had fallen.
More than once, I noticed black forms on the top of the banks which moved silently about and watched me through the tall grasses. This scrutiny was full of curiosity, but it was not hostile. I believe these savages wished rather to express their sympathy and their pity. And doubtless they were the very men who'd killed my son on the same spot. Towards morning, a strange thing happened. Although there was not a breath of air, the flames of the candles were suddenly deflected, as if someone wished to extinguish them. And I said to him, "Is it indeed you beside me? Do you wish me to go away?"
Now, a century later, what is there still to remind us of the main characters in our story? This is Farnborough Hill in Hampshire. Eugenie acquired it on her return from Zululand, and here she devoted herself to the commemoration of her husband and her son. Opposite, where she could see it across the valley, she built a mausoleum for her family. In the crypt lies the granite sarcophagus which contains the body of Napoleon III. Above the high altar, Eugenie herself is buried. Beside them lies their only son, the Prince Imperial. But what of the other protagonist of our story? On the coast of Devon is the little town of Brixham. This is the churchyard, now overgrown, of St. Mary's. And here there's another, more modest memorial. It's his only monument, and even this he shares with his father, who was vicar here for 40 years. His name doesn't appear on the headstone, only on the side. Jalil B. Carey, Captain 98th Regiment, died at Karachi, 22nd of February, 1883, aged 35 years. In St. George's Chapel, Windsor, Queen Victoria installed this marble effigy of the Prince Imperial. Now, oblivion covers him too. But no one who was alive at the time was ever to forget the events which overtook those two men when they rowed down towards that riverbed in Zululand a century ago.